Hello, we're talking about thinning the paint down. So that could mean thinning its viscosity and or its opacity. So we're talking about thinning the paints down. While I'm yabbering away, I'll get you to put a little dot of paint up here in the corner on your cards, and then with the water, you're just going to use a wet brush and maybe a little bit more water and spread the paint out slowly until you kind of run out of paint and it gets nice and thin. With the spreader medium, a similar thing, a daub of paint and then a little bit more of a daub of probably 2 to 3 times the amount of spreader, but no more. And do the same thing, mix it down. The surface tension breaker, I'll get you to add 5% of surface tension breaker to a little cup of water, like only needs to be a couple of ounces of water and a few mils of that. And then the same as you did the first time round, a little bit of paint, and then work it out. And you should be able to see the way it disperses on the card far more easily than what it does with the water. And then the acrylic painting medium, it's very thin, but the same thing, a daub of paint, and then however much you like of that, much the same as the water, just try and thin it down. And once this one dries, you'll see over the other three, it's much glossier. So we'll start with water, and water's probably the most used medium, I would suggest, with acrylics, certainly with people starting out anyway. Adding water to the paint is fine as long as you keep a couple of things in mind. So the first thing is the paint, as we've talked about before, has colorant, the pigment, has the binder and the vehicle, and the binder and the vehicle are the acrylic. When we add water, we're just adding more vehicle, no binder. So we are reducing the ability for the paint to hold on. So the maximum safe amount of water to put in is about 1 part water to 4 parts paint, about 20%. You can go higher with some colours, and each colour will be slightly different. You can go a bit higher, but if you stick with 20% water maximum, then you should be good. Now, one quick thing I will mention, when you're adding water to the paint, if you're planning on keeping it, like if you're just adding water and then painting it out, not a problem, the water evaporates out, happy days. But if you're planning on keeping the paint, especially in areas that are a bit warm or where your paint might sit around for a while and it gets a bit warm, you will introduce bugs into the paint. Now the paints have bactericides in them to stop that happening in and of themselves. But as soon as you effectively, say you add 20%, you're diluting the bactericide by 20%. Plus, if you've just taken that water straight out of the tap, unfortunately, you've added a heap of bugs too, because there's a whole lot of bacteria that's in the water. Apparently safe enough for us to drink, but don't use tap water if you're going to keep the paint. What you need to do is use distilled water. The best way to clean your water, and it will work perfectly, is water in a saucepan brought to the boil for 3 minutes. So it must be a rolling boil for 3 minutes. An electric kettle won't do that because you'll burn the kettle out if you try and keep it boiling for 3 minutes. So just a normal saucepan, rolling boil, minimum 3 minutes. You can go for 5 if you want. That will kill any of the bugs that are going to worry us. Leave the water to cool, use that water in your paint, but no more than 20%. And the reason I say don't add any more than 20% water is because we want to keep the acrylics water resistant. That's what they are. They would normally dry, so the next layer going over the top or a glaze going over the top will not shift the layer underneath. If that isn't of a concern, then you can add as much water as you want. For instance, if you were going to paint in a watercolour style and you took phthalo blue or ultra blue, very deep dark colours, and you wanted to do a sky, for instance, and you washed them down to sort of white at the horizon, that's fine as long as you treat them like watercolours. In other words, know that water may well re-wet some of that colour. So if you try to glaze over the top or you spill a cup of coffee over the top or something, it might move some of the colour. So you need to put them behind glass or spray a varnish over them. There's several ways to fix them. That's using water. If you wanted to do the same thing but not have it move, so reduce the colour right down from dark blue to white, then you would add acrylic painting medium. Acrylic painting medium is a 100% binder with about 50% solids. Use that like you would use water to reduce it down. The acrylic painting medium is as thin as water, but it's got binder in it, and you can add as much of that as you like. One thing to keep in mind, it will be slightly glossier than what you would achieve by just adding water. Now, the couple of other mediums I've got here, the surface tension breaker, so it's kind of a chemical name, I guess. It chemically breaks the paint down. The pigment particles will want to stick together. They'll want to conglomerate. We want to chemically break that down to make it easier to disperse the colour. As we talked about, if you wanted to reduce a dark blue down to white, you don't want little lumps of colour, or what's otherwise known in watercolours as granulation. So the surface tension breaker will chemically disperse the pigment particles and break their surface tension and allow them to separate. Now, this is actually quite an old surface tension breaker, but you'll see it's slightly yellow. You're only using 3% in the water, so you're not going to notice any sort of discoloration. That's fine if it's not completely clear. There's very little that you're going to be using in there, and it won't discolour your work. So yes, a maximum of about 5% surface tension breaker to the paint or in your water. It's easier just to put about 5% in the water and then use that water. You could indeed put 5% into the acrylic painting medium if you just wanted to use the acrylic painting medium. Indeed, you could mix 50% water with 50% acrylic painting medium, and I know this doesn't add up with percentages, but then 5% more of the surface tension breaker. And that will be a great mix for watercolour, even airbrush. So if you want to put the acrylics through an airbrush, certainly if structure, for instance, just won't go through an airbrush without being let down viscosity-wise, the pigment particles and everything in it are small enough to go through the finest airbrush, but if it's too thick, it just won't flow through. So that's where you want something like the acrylic painting medium. A little bit of surface tension break is just going to make it easier to disperse everything. You can thin it right down. That'll go through an airbrush. You may even actually want to add a little bit of drying retarder, a couple of drops of that to stop it drying in the tip. But moving on to the spreader medium, the spreader medium can be best thought of as thick water. So it does not impart, like water, it imparts no binding ability, but as you can see, it's clear. So if you struggle a little bit with adding acrylics which look milky and so can sometimes make the colour a little lighter, depends on the colour, then something like spreader medium could work really well for you because it's clear. Its main job, as you can see here, is really to keep the paint almost the opposite to the surface tension breaker, keep the paint together. So where we've used water here and it's dispersed out reasonably, and we've used the surface tension breaker here and it really does help to disperse it, the spreader medium will almost do the opposite. If you can imagine using this quite thick water, adding a bit of colour to it and either mixing it in really thoroughly, and you'll end up with a glaze because it will make the colour, whilst it won't thin the paint too much, it's about the same viscosity as Matisse flow, not structure but flow. So it's not like adding water where the paint then goes really thin. If you just want to do glazes, and that's what the spreader medium is for, you can add the colour or add the spreader medium to the paint, and then you will get thin, transparent glazes, even with opaque colours. Once again, don't add any more than about 20 or 30% spreader medium to the paint, or it could become water sensitive like we talked about with the water. So we've talked about all the thinners, Sorry I didn't stay in order. But all the mediums are intermixable with all of the Matisse ranges. And in a lot of cases you can use, as we said, you could use the water with the acrylic painting medium and a little bit of surface tension breaker and a bit of drying retarder. So the mediums aren't always mutually exclusive. You know, you can use quite a few together. So these mediums will mix with any of the other Matisse products, but obviously, you know, mixing acrylic painting medium with structure will thin it down. So if you bought structure because you want thick paint, then acrylic painting medium is not really what you're after. All the mediums we talked about here are all wash them up with soap and water. Obviously, if you leave them to dry and you brush the acrylic painting medium, that's going to be harder to get out. You're going to need our brush cleaner. So that's pretty well it for thinning the paints down.